Hello, so now I'm going to annotate the first half of The Last Night, or the section I asked you to read on Wednesday. So the chapter is The Last Night. So we know we're reaching some kind of climax here, some kind of end to the novel. This is spoiler alert, the final chapter with Mr. Utterson, and this is the last time we sort of see the story from his perspective, which we've kind of been following for the whole novel. But from this there are two more chapters after this, but they won't be following Utterson. So quite an important, a very important chapter really, which is why I broke it into two halves for your reading. So Mr. Utterson was sitting by his fireside one evening after dinner. Now you might remember this from the beginning, so we've got a very sort of circular structure there. The first time we met him, he was sitting by his fireside, and that's what he's doing in this final chapter. So we've got this kind of repetition here. When he was surprised to receive a visit from Paul. Remember, Paul is the butler of Dr. Jekyll. "Bless me, Paul, what brings you here?" he cried, and then taking a second look at him, "What ails you, as in, what's wrong with you?" He added, "Is the doctor ill?" So, there's great surprise, and I think it's very much out of the norm for a butler to go visit the man of the house's friend or lawyer. So he's obviously very shocked, very surprised to see him. "Mr. Utterson," said the man, "there is something wrong." "Take a seat, and here is a glass of wine for you," said the lawyer. "Now, take your time and tell me plainly what you want." So, take your time, again, quite friendly there from Utterson. "You know the doctor's ways, sir," replied Paul, "and how he shuts himself up. Well, he's shut up again in the cabinet, and I don't like it, sir. I wish I may die if I like it, Mr. Utterson, sir. I'm afraid. This idea of fear has been running throughout the novel. And now Paul, the servant, is very afraid of what's happening to Jekyll. We get again this plot that he is shut up again in the cabinet. Remember, cabinet, not a wardrobe, but like a kind of like little office of his, okay? A little enclosure of his. "Now, my good man," said the lawyer, "be explicit, as in be clear. Like, tell me exactly what you mean. What are you afraid of?" "I've been afraid for about a week," returned Paul, doggedly disregarding the question, "and I can bear it no more." The man's appearance amply bore out his words. His manner was altered for the worse, and except for the moment when he had first announced his terror, he had not once looked the lawyer in the face. So there's almost shame in the way that he's afraid here. He's perhaps afraid, he's ashamed of being afraid, but also possibly ashamed of what he's been thinking perhaps about what's going on with his master. Even now he sat with a glass of wine untasted on his knee, and his eyes directed to a corner of the floor. "I can bear it no more," he repeated. He can't keep it in anymore. He needs to tell someone. And by the way, the word terror there as well, quite important. That's popped up quite a lot in the book, hasn't it? This idea of terror. "Come," said the lawyer. "I see you have some good reason, Paul. I see there is something seriously amiss," or, amiss just means something wrong. "Try to tell me what it is." "I think there's been foul play," said Paul hoarsely. Foul play, okay? It's an interesting thing to think, what does foul play mean here? But I'm just going to sort of tell you. Here, he really is talking about murder. He thinks there's been foul play, and I think by that we can kind of assume he means murder. He says it hoarsely as well. We had that word a couple of times in this book, this adverb for when people speak. Clearly he's frightened, and that's what hoarsely is sort of showing there. "Foul play!" cried the lawyer, a good deal frightened, and rather inclined to be irritated in consequence. "What foul play? What does the man mean?" I daren't say, sir," was the answer, "but will you come along with me and see for yourself?" Just notice some interesting response from Utterson. He's frightened, but there's also a sense of kind of, he's inclined to be irritated by this, like this accusation against his master there's a class thing going on here. I need to sort of stress this. Paul is a butler, and he is a lower class to Utterson and to Jekyll. So for Paul to accuse his master of being involved in some kind of murder is obviously, Utterson isn't going to take it as seriously as you'd take it if he heard it from someone of the same class or of a higher class. So class really, really important here in the book. Mr. Utterson's only answer was to rise and get his hat and greatcoat, so he is going to go with him. But he observed with wonder the greatness of the relief that appeared. So there's relief from Paul that appeared on the butler's face, and perhaps with no less that the wine was still untasted when he set it down to follow. So the butler doesn't drink the wine. He's so, and that's out of fear. So really clear, he couldn't touch his wine because of the fear he was feeling. It was a wide, cold, seasonable night of March with a pale moon. We get that pale moon again, kind of some, that idea that, again, it's quite ominous. Lying on her back as though the wind had tilted her. And we get this personification here of the moon. It's lying on its back as though it's been blown over, and a flying rack of the most diaphanous and lawny texture. The wind made talking difficult and flecked the blood into the face. So they're kind of like, it's making their blood flow into their faces. You can see the redness in their face. It seemed to have swept the streets unusually bare of passengers. Besides, for Mr. Utterson thought he had never seen that part of London so deserted. So, it's classic kind of Gothic literature to kind of make a place that's usually full of people empty. So this kind of emptiness adds to the kind of eeriness of this journey across London. Eerie, remember, E-E-R-I-E, two E's at the beginning. He could have wished it otherwise. Never in his life had he been conscious of so sharp a wish to see and touch his fellow creatures. For struggle as he might, there was borne upon his mind a crushing anticipation of calamity. Calamity is like disaster. So he's got this he's got this feeling, and he wishes there were more people around to kind of comfort him, because he's so worried about this kind of crushing anticipation of disaster, of imminent disaster. The square, when they got there, was all full of wind and dust, and the thin trees in the garden were lashing themselves along the railing. So even the trees are kind of lashing themselves here. So it's like nature is alive in this paragraph. Paul, who had kept all the way a pace or two ahead, now pulled up in the middle of the pavement, and in spite of the biting weather, took off his hat and mopped his brow with a red pocket handkerchief. But for all the hurry of his coming, there was not the dews of exertion that he wiped away, but the moisture of some strangling anguish. So he's in kind of anguish, which is like a pain. For his face was white, fear, and his voice, when he spoke, harsh and broken. "Well, sir," he said, "here we are, and God grant," there's God again, "there be nothing wrong." "Amen, Paul," said the lawyer. So they're in agreement. They both know that they're dealing with something here that could be, that they need God for. They need kind of religious comfort for. Thereupon the servant knocked in a very guarded manner. The door was opened on the chain, and a voice asked from within, "Is that you, Paul?" "It's all right," said Paul. "Open the door." The hall, when they entered it, was brightly lighted up. The fire was built high, and about the hearth, the fireplace, the whole of the servants, men and women, stood huddled together like a flock of sheep. One thing to say here is, again, this class thing. All the servants are kind of huddled together in fear, and they're huddled together, and there's a simile there, like a flock of sheep. They're lacking direction. They don't know what to do. Flocks of sheep, not regarded as the most intelligent of creatures. No offense to sheep fans out there, but this lower class, these servants, they're all like, they don't know what to do. At the sight of Mr. Utterson, the housemaid broke into hysterical whimpering, and the cook, crying out, "Bless God, it's Mr. Utterson," ran forward as if to take him in her arms. So Utterson here becoming like a hero. And there's no coincidence that he's a more upper middle class to completely upper class character. And the way that it's quite an interesting representation of class here, because Stevenson's basically saying that the servants are helpless without the kind of heroic upper class posh man to come and help them. It tells you something about Victorian society that he writes it that way. I'm certain that it's very stereotypical, isn't it, of kind of the lower class in this book. But yeah, they're so happy that he's here. Utterson, the hero, the action hero, is here in this chapter. What? What? Are you all here? Said the lawyer peevishly. So he's a bit annoyed. Very irregular, very unseemly. Your master would be far from pleased. So he quickly has a kind of dig at them all. He says, "You shouldn't all be round the fire. You should be doing your servant jobs, below stairs." So he kind of tells them off. "They're all afraid," said Paul. Blank silence followed, no one protesting. Only the maid lifted up her voice and now wept loudly. So women again are kind of, if you think about stereotypes again, what's the woman doing? She's crying. Very sort of stereotypical view of Victorian literature. It's funny, isn't it? Like, you wouldn't get away with that today. Just having all the female characters crying, all the poor characters needing the richer characters to help them. So here we really do get some slightly problematic features of the book in this chapter. Some sort of stereotyping going on. Okay, so next page. Hold your tongue. Again, Paul said to her. So Paul pulling rank here. As a butler, he'd be kind of boss of all the servants. With a ferocity of accent that testified to his own jangled nerves. And indeed, when the girl had so suddenly raised a note of her lamentation just means kind of like expressing sadness. They all started and turned towards the inner door with faces of dreadful expectation. There's this kind of feeling of dread, of fear. "And now," continued the butler, addressing the knife boy, "reach me a candle, and we'll get this through hands at once." And then he begged Mr. Utterson to follow him and led the way to the back garden. By the way, classic, using a candle. Now, literally in the story, they need a candle to light the way, but it's almost like the light will reveal mystery. There's a common use of light in the book. It's like light is often used to reveal mystery, whether that be moonlight or candlelight. "Now, sir," said he, "you come as gently as you can. I want you to hear, and I don't want you to be heard. And see here, sir, if by any chance he was to ask you in, don't go." So we get some warning from Paul here. He's saying, look, I want you to listen, but I don't want you to go into the room and have a look at what's going on. Just listen, and you'll see what I mean. Mr. Utterson's nerves at this unlooked-for termination gave a jerk that nearly threw him from his balance. So, there's great fear in Utterson now as well. He like physically jolts at the kind of the fear here of what could happen. Just zoom in a bit. But it's a bit blurry, come on. But he recollected his courage and followed the butler into the laboratory building and through the surgical theatre, with its lumber of crates and bottles, to the foot of the stair. So they walked through the building. Here Paul motioned him to stand on one side and listen, while he himself, setting down the candle and making a great and obvious call on his resolution, mounted the steps and knocked with a somewhat uncertain hand on the red baize of the cabinet door. So again we get this red door, that the mystery... The answer to the mystery lies behind, this red door. "Mr. Utterson, sir, asking to see you," he called. And even as he did so, once more violently signed to the lawyer to give ear. So he's saying, look, listen to this. A voice. And look at the mystery there. We don't know whose voice it is. Answered from within. "Tell him I cannot see anyone," it said complainingly. So again, this strange voice that doesn't fully sound like JEKYLL says in this complaining way that he doesn't want to see anyone. Again, like a command. That is an imperative, okay? Tell is the imperative verb there. But the whole sentence really is as an imperative. "Thank you, sir," said Paul, with a note of something like triumph in his voice. So Paul is quite happy that his plan has worked. He's got them speaking. And taking up his candle, he led Mr. Utterson back across the yard and into the great kitchen, where the fire was out and the beetles were leaping on the floor. "Sir," he said, looking Mr. Utterson in the eyes, "was that my master's voice?" "It seems much changed." So there seems like there's been a big change to the voice, replied the lawyer, very pale. Again, fear, but giving look for look. "Changed? Well, yes, I think so," said the butler. Have I been 20 years in this man's house to be deceived about his voice? So Paul's worked there for 20 years and he's saying, look, I know his voice when I hear it. No, sir. Master's made away with. Again, this is like made away with is kind of a way of saying he's been murdered. He was made away with 8 days ago when we heard him cry out upon the name of God. And who's in there instead of him? And why it stays there is a thing that cries to heaven, Mr. Utterson. So again, he says about the name of God, about heaven, like, he needs religion to help explain this. But, these are the key mysteries. Who's in there and why are they there? And these are mysteries for the reader as well. Yeah, Utterson in some ways is a surrogate for the reader. He kind of plays our part in the, we experiencing everything Utterson experiences. And here, Paul is making a good point. Why is in there? Who is in there? Two big questions. 2 more pages to go. This is a very strange tale, Paul. This is a rather wild tale. He goes from strange to wild. This is like an irrational tale, and it goes against all of Utterson's instincts. He's a rational man, and this sounds kind of irrational, said Mr. Utterson, biting his finger. Suppose it were as you suppose. Supposing Dr. Jekyll to have been, murdered. What could induce the murderer to stay? That won't hold water. It doesn't commend itself to reason. Again, really clear view there about the way that Utterson thinks. He's all about this word, reason. He has to kind of think through everything rationally, logically, and he raises a good point. If someone has murdered Dr. Jekyll, why are they staying in his room and trying to sound like him? It's not you have to be a pretty stupid murderer to do that. Well, Mr. Utterson, you are a hard man to satisfy, but I'll do it yet. So it's hard to convince Utterson about what's going on, but Paul's going to try. Said Paul, all this last week. You must know, him or it, we get that pronoun there, it, almost like he's a monster, or whatever it is that lives in that cabinet, has been crying night and day for some sort of medicine and cannot get it to his mind. So he's looking for this medicine, looking for some medicine. It was sometimes his way, the master's that is, to write his orders on a sheet of paper and throw it on the stair. We'd have nothing else this week back, nothing but papers and a closed door. So he's sort of chucking little notes on papers out of this closed door. And the very meals left there to be smuggled in when nobody was looking. Well, sir, every day, aye, and twice and thrice in the same day, so 3 times, there have been orders and complaints, and I've been sent flying to all the wholesale chemists in town. Every time I brought the stuff back, there would be another paper telling me to return it because it was not pure, and another order to a different firm. This drug is wanted bitter bad, sir, whatever for. So the voice inside the door is asking for this drug. It's almost like they're an addict. They're desperate for more, and clearly they can't get any more. And Paul's been sent out to go to the chemist to get all these medicines, and none of them are good enough because they're not pure enough. I think that's the key thing, is that they're not pure. Have you any of these papers? Asked Mr. Utterson. Paul felt in his pocket and handed out a crumpled note, which the lawyer, bending nearer to the candle, carefully examined. Its contents ran thus, so we're going to read one of the notes. Dr. Jekyll presents his compliments to Messrs. Moore. Now they must be chemists. He assures them that their last sample is impure and quite useless. So, the sample he's got is just not good enough. In the year 18, Dr. J purchased a somewhat large quantity from Messrs. M. He now begs them to search with the most sedulous, like the most careful care. I think we've had that word already. And should any of the same quality be left, to forward it to him at once. Expense is no consideration, so he'll pay whatever it takes to get this drug. The importance of this to Dr. J can hardly be exaggerated. So far the letter had run composedly enough, but here with a sudden splutter, lovely alliteration, a sudden splutter of the pen, the writer's emotion had broken loose. For God's sake, he had added, find me some of the old. So, this is quite impolite, it's quite rude, it's desperate. And he's begging this chemist, please get me some of that stuff you've given me before. It is really like someone who's addicted to drugs, desperate for more. This is a strange note, said Utterson. And then sharply, how do you come to have it open? You know, a classic. Utterson is like wondering if Paul has opened post he shouldn't have opened. The man at Moores was main angry, sir, and he threw it back to me so much like dirt, returned Paul. So the chemist was angry, probably because, you know, he can't give Jekyll, he can't give this voice behind the door, Jay, you know, the drug. He can't do it. Last page. This is unquestionably the doctor's hand. Do you know, resumed the lawyer. So this is the handwriting, back to handwriting again, is Dr. Jekyll's. I thought it looked like it, said the servant rather sulkily, and then with another voice, but what matters hand of right, he said, I've seen him. So we've got this kind of progression. We get the voice. So, you know, if you think about the 3 steps, we get the voice, the handwriting, and, you know, the real thing that's driving Paul, he could have just said it in the first place, couldn't he? Paul has seen him. They're like the 3 steps to trying to convince Utterson, but still Utterson will not be convinced of anything strange. Seen him? Repeated Mr. Utterson. Well, that's it, said Paul. It was this way, and now Paul will become our kind of storyteller here. He'll become our narrator for this paragraph. Notice how this book switches narrators quite a lot. I came suddenly into the theatre from the garden. It seems he had slipped out to look for his drug or whatever it is, for the cabinet door was open, and there he was at the far end of the room digging among the crates. He looked up when I came in, gave a kind of cry, say cries, and whipped upstairs into the cabinet. So whipped, he said it really quickly. It was but for 1 minute that I saw him, but the hair stood upon my head like quills. Again, a simile of like, you know, the kind of like feathered pens I used to use. Sir, if that was my master, why had he a mask upon his face? So he thinks Jekyll is wearing a mask. I think it's a metaphor, by the way. If it was my master, why did he cry out like a rat? So a simile again, like an animal simile here. We could also call that sort of zoomorphism. You know, changing him to an animal. And run from me. I have served him long enough. And then the man paused and passed his hand over his face. So he pauses because he can't believe he's saying this out loud. These are all very strange circumstances, said Mr. Utterson, but I think I begin to see daylight. So he thinks he sees truth. Your master, Paul, is plainly seized with one of those maladies that both torture and deform the sufferer. Maladies is an illness. So he just thinks, it's a kind of illness. It affects people. It deforms them a bit, and, you know, a bit like leprosy or something. You know, there's something wrong with him. Hence, for aught I know, the alteration of his voice. Hence the mask and his avoidance of his friends. Hence his eagerness to find this drug, by means of which the poor soul retains some hope of ultimate recovery. God grant that he be not deceived. There is my explanation. It is sad enough, and appalling to consider, but it is plain and natural. So this explanation that, he's just got this disease or something, that's what's wrong with him, and that's a plain and natural thing, you know, not supernatural. And he's desperately clinging on to this idea of reason and the rational. You know, this is nothing strange, he's basically saying. Even though we as readers know, don't we? We can kind of guess it's something pretty odd that's going on. And he says it hangs well together and delivers us from all exorbitant alarms. Exorbitant meaning kind of outrageous. Like outrageous alarms. Sir, said the butler, turning to a sort of mottled pallor, that thing was not my master. And there's the truth. My master, here he looked round him and began to whisper, is a tall, fine build of a man. And this was more of a dwarf. Okay, again, we now know as a reader, this is definitely Hyde he's talking about. And, you know, you could say that he looks a bit weird because he you know, all those things that Jekyll has, Utterson has rationalized about what's happened to Jekyll. but there's no illness that makes you lose height, really, is there? So that's why I think it's the last like hammer blow from Paul that is, telling him about what might have happened here. Utterson attempted to protest. "Oh, sir," cried Paul, "do you think I do not know my master after 20 years? Do you think I do not know where his head comes to in the cabinet door, where I saw him every morning of my life?" We get these kind of rhetorical questions here from Paul. "No, sir, that thing in the mask was never Dr. Jekyll. God knows what it was, but it was never Dr. Jekyll, and it is the belief of my heart that there was murder done." So he thinks that this kind of creature has murdered Jekyll, this weird man has murdered Jekyll and is now in his place. And that's where we're going to leave this first half of the chapter today. I hope you managed to sort of carry on annotating that. We'll carry on reading the rest when we come back after half term. For one last time this term, over to you, Mr. Owen, the one and only.